On January 22nd, 1879, right in the middle of a scorching South African summer afternoon, the sun suddenly began to die. A solar eclipse swept across the sky, plunging the savannah into an eerie, cold midday twilight. The local Zulu called it the Day of the Dead Sun. For over 1,300 British soldiers, lying at the base of a jagged mountain named Isandlwana, the eclipse didn't matter. They were already dead. Just 2 hours earlier, these men represented the apex of Victorian industrial warfare. In their hands were state-of-the-art Martini Henry rifles, capable of putting 10 aimed heavy lead rounds downrange every 60 seconds. Behind them was the British Empire, the wealthiest superpower on Earth. Against them stood an enemy with no cannons, no cavalry, and no armor. Men armed primarily with cowhide shields and short stabbing spears, called assegais. By 3 p.m., an entire British Imperial battalion had been wiped out. Not routed, not forced into retreat, annihilated. It was the single greatest colonial humiliation in the history of the British Empire. But the most horrifying part of Isandlwana isn't how it ended. It's that in the 24 hours leading up to the disaster, the men in charge were handed 5 separate chances to stop it, and ignored every single one. To understand how an army of spears dismantled modern firepower in under 2 hours, you have to look at the man who marched them there, Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford. Chelmsford was an aristocrat, a veteran of the Crimean War and the Indian Rebellion. To him, the Anglo-Zulu War wasn't a campaign, it was a policing action. When British High Commissioner Sir Bartle Frere issued an impossible ultimatum to King Cetshwayo demanding the total disbanding of the Zulu nation, war became inevitable. Chelmsford crossed the Buffalo River with over 4,000 men split into 3 columns. On January 20th, the center column set up camp beneath Mount Isandlwana, an imposing, isolated rock formation that looked remarkably like a crouching sphinx. And here, Chelmsford made fatal mistake number 1. British military field regulations were crystal clear. Whenever an expeditionary force halted in hostile territory, the camp had to be fortified. You dug trenches, you built breastworks, or at the very least, you locked the heavy ox-drawn supply wagons into a tight perimeter circle known as a logger. Local Boer commanders with decades of frontier experience warned Chelmsford directly. They told him the Zulu moved with terrifying speed across open terrain and could cover 40 miles a day on foot. Chelmsford laughed it off. He considered a logger a waste of valuable time. The ground was hard, his men were tired, and besides, what native force would dare attack an open British camp in broad daylight? The tents were pitched in long, picturesque Victorian rows. The wagons were parked haphazardly. The perimeter was left completely open. On the night of January 21st, British scouts reported small bands of Zulu skirmishers moving southeast, away from the mountain. Chelmsford took the bait. He convinced himself that the Zulu army was attempting to slip past him, avoiding a fight. Determined to corner them, Chelmsford made fatal mistake number 2. He split his force. Before dawn on January 22nd, Chelmsford rode out of camp with nearly half the infantry, the mounted cavalry, and the bulk of the artillery, marching straight into the hills to hunt the decoy. He left roughly 1,300 infantry, colonial auxiliaries, and camp followers behind under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pooline, an administrator with virtually no combat command experience. Pouline's orders were simple: defend the camp. As Chelmsford vanished over the horizon, another officer arrived at Isandlwana, Colonel Anthony Durnford, a charismatic, one-armed veteran leading a unit of mounted native troops. Durnford outranked Pouline, but rather than coordinating a unified defense inside the camp, Durnford took his men out to scout the eastern ridges. At 11 a.m., a small patrol of British cavalry led by Lieutenant Raw chased a handful of Zulu foragers to the lip of a deep, dry ravine, a donga, 5 miles northeast of the camp. Raw rode his horse to the edge, looked down, and felt his stomach drop. Sitting in total, absolute silence in the valley below were 20,000 Zulu warriors. The Zulu hadn't planned to attack that day. It was the night of the new moon, an inauspicious omen in their culture. But when the British scouts saw them, the element of surprise was broken. A single war leader stood up, waved his hand, and 20,000 men stood up with him. The Zulu army executed their signature battle tactic, the impi formation, known as the horns of the buffalo. The chest, the massive center column of hardened veterans, charged straight toward the British line to pin them down. The horns, 2 lightning-fast flanking wings, broke off to the left and right, sweeping around the mountain in a massive pincer movement to cut off every escape route to the river. The loins, a massive reserve force held back behind the chest, waiting to exploit any breach in the enemy line. Inside the camp, bugles screamed to arms. Colonel Pauline deployed 6 companies of the 24th Regiment of Foot, but instead of clustering around the base of the rock, where their flanks would be protected, he stretched his men out into a classic, paper-thin firing line over a mile long. For the first 20 minutes, Victorian firepower did exactly what it was designed to do. The British redcoats knelt in the grass, loading and firing in rhythmic, disciplined volleys. Martini Henry rifles tore into the advancing Zulu chest at 400 yards, then 300, then 200. The wall of lead was so dense that the center of the Zulu charge stalled, pinned behind a ridge of fallen warriors. British officers looked down the line with relief. The technology was holding. And then, the guns began to go silent. 2 catastrophic failures hit the British line at the exact same second. First came the ammunition crisis. The British were burning through cartridges at an unprecedented rate. Runners sprinted back to the quartermaster wagons to get fresh supplies, only to run into imperial bureaucracy. The heavy ammunition boxes were sealed shut with thick copper bands and secured with slotted iron screws. Standard-issue screwdrivers were missing or scarce. Quartermasters, terrified of violating military accountability regulations, allegedly refused to open crates for soldiers who didn't belong to their specific company. Men stood helpless with bayonets, desperately trying to smash through solid oak while their comrades ran dry at the front. Second came the weapon failure. Under the blistering African sun, the soft brass casings of the Martini Henry ammunition expanded inside overheated chambers. The extractors tore through the rim of the cartridge, jamming the breech. Soldiers began frantically trying to pry stuck casings out with their pocket knives, while their fingers blistered on the red-hot barrels. On the far right, Colonel Durnford's mounted troops ran completely out of ammunition and were forced to pull back. The gap opened. The left horn of the Zulu buffalo surged through the breach. A war leader in the center saw the hesitation in the British line and screamed the battle cry. "The chest is eating! Forward!" The thin red line didn't just break, it evaporated. What followed was a horrific, close-quarters melee among the white canvas tents. There was no organized retreat. Small knots of soldiers stood back to back, fighting with bayonets and rifle butts against a surging sea of shields. Lieutenants Melville and Coghill made a desperate gallop on horseback to save the Queen's color silk flag, crossing the swollen river before dying together on the opposite bank. By the time the solar eclipse cast its eerie shadow over the peak of Isandlwana, the shooting had stopped. Over 1,300 British soldiers and native allies lay dead. Late that evening, Lord Chelmsford rode back into the camp, blissfully unaware of what had happened. He and his men dismounted in total darkness, stepping over the destroyed camp and the shattered remnants of their own regiment. To cover up the staggering incompetence of high command, the British press and government immediately shifted the narrative. They focused the entire empire's attention on Wark's Drift, a minor supply depot 10 miles away, where 150 British soldiers successfully defended a hospital against 4,000 Zulu reserves. 11 Victoria Crosses were handed out in a deliberate attempt to flood the newspapers with heroism and bury the shame of Isandlwana. Isandlwana remains one of the starkest reminders in military history that modern technology means nothing against a determined enemy if your leadership is blinded by arrogance. The British took back the field months later with reinforcements and Gatling guns, eventually destroying the Zulu kingdom. But on that quiet January afternoon beneath the Sphinx Rock, 20,000 men with cowhide shields proved that even the greatest empire.
What do you think was the fatal turning point at Isandlwana? The split command, the lack of fortifications, or the ammunition failure? Let me know in the comments below. If you love deep, unvarnished dives into forgotten military history, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next breakdown. Thanks for watching.